The wind hit my face like a wall of broken glass before the drop pod even finished opening, and I knew right away that something about this drill was wrong. My name is Owen Marsh, and I was standing on a frozen moon called Cassandra Minor, with 53 other cadets, and none of us had signed up to die today, even though dying today was apparently on the syllabus. The Class 9 Blizzard survival drill was the kind of thing older cadets warned you about in whispers. They called it the moon that eats people. Not because anyone had actually died, but because the fail rate sat somewhere around 60% every single year. You got dropped with a thin thermal suit, a beacon, a knife, and a ration bar, and you had 4 hours to reach an extraction point 11 kilometers away, through a storm that could freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. The instructors called it character building. We called it insane. I remember standing in the staging bay an hour before the drop, my 4 limbs shaking, my breathing tubes fogging up every time I exhaled, and I remember looking around at the rest of my squad and seeing the exact same fear reflected back at me. Priya Nolan was chewing on her lips so hard I thought she might draw blood. Callum Ashworth kept checking his beacon over and over like it might stop working out of spite. Felix Doran had gone completely silent, which for Felix was somehow more alarming than if he had been screaming. And then there was her. Marlo Reyes stood near the back of the group with her arms crossed and her head tilted slightly, watching the storm readouts on the briefing screen the way someone might watch a mildly interesting weather report on a lazy afternoon. She was human, one of maybe a dozen humans in the entire academy, and everyone knew what that meant, or thought they knew. Humans came from a planet the Coalition had officially classified as a Deathworld, a place so hostile that simply being born there and reaching adulthood was treated as a kind of unofficial military qualification. Nobody really understood what that meant in practice. We had all heard the stories, the exaggerations, the rumors that got wilder every time they were repeated in the mess hall. Some cadets said humans could survive without oxygen for 10 minutes. Others said their planet had gravity 3 times standard. I didn't believe most of it. I still don't know how much of it was true. But standing there in that staging bay, watching Marlo Reyes look bored, while the rest of us looked like we were about to be sick, I started to wonder if maybe the rumors had not gone far enough. Instructor Voss walked in exactly on schedule, her expression carved from something colder than the moon we were about to be dropped on. She was Threxian, tall, gray-skinned, with eyes that never seemed to blink at the right times, and she had run this drill for 11 years without once softening her tone about it. "Listen carefully," she said, "because I will only say this once. The storm on Cassandra Minor today is rated at standard severity for this exercise. Your suits are rated to withstand 2 hours of direct exposure before core temperature becomes a medical concern. You have 4 hours to reach extraction point Delta. That means you cannot be in the open the entire time. You must find shelter, manage your exposure, and move with discipline. Cadets who fail to reach extraction, or whose vitals drop below safety threshold, will have their beacon triggered automatically and will be pulled from the exercise. A failure on this drill does not end your career, but it will follow you." She paused, scanning the room the way a predator scans a field before deciding which direction to move. "Questions," she said, in a tone that made it clear questions were not actually welcome. "Before I go further, I should explain a little about the Academy itself, because it matters for what happened next. The Coalition Officer Academy trained cadets from over 40 member species, all of us funneled into the same barracks, the same mess halls, the same brutal training schedules, in the hope that we would one day serve together on Coalition ships, without hesitation or distrust. It was a noble idea on paper. In practice, most species kept to their own kind out of habit, trading polite nods in the corridors and little else. Humans were the newest addition to the Coalition, having joined only a decade earlier after what the history files described, with careful diplomatic vagueness, as a first contact situation that ended very differently than the scouting ship involved had expected. Nobody talked about the details openly. I had heard secondhand that the scouting ship's entire mission profile had been rewritten within a single day of contact, and that the officer who filed the report afterward had requested reassignment somewhere far away from anything resembling a human settlement. I never confirmed whether that story was true. I am not sure I wanted it to be. What I did know was that humans arrived at the Academy with reputations that preceded them by years, reputations built on half-truths and exaggerated rumors that grew wilder with each retelling in the mess hall. Some cadets swore humans could go without sleep for a week. Others insisted their bones were denser than Durasteel plating. A particularly persistent rumor claimed humans could smell fear the way some predator species could, which was almost certainly nonsense, though I noticed nobody ever tested that theory to Marlowe's face. Whatever the truth was buried under all that exaggeration, one fact remained consistent across every version of the stories. Humans came from a world where survival itself was considered an achievement, not a guarantee, and the Coalition's own classification system had labeled that world a death world, using a formal designation reserved for planets, where the baseline environment alone was rated capable of killing an untrained visitor within days. I had never met a human before Marlowe transferred into our squad 3 months earlier. My first impression of her had been almost disappointing in its ordinariness. She was of average height for her species, dark-haired, quick to smile, quicker to laugh, and utterly unremarkable in every way that the rumors had promised she would not be. She did not lift equipment she should not have been able to lift. She did not stare down instructors with unnerving confidence. She simply showed up, did the work, cracked jokes that landed about half the time, and generally behaved like any other exhausted cadet grinding through a demanding curriculum. It had taken me weeks to notice the small things. The way she never seemed cold in the training halls when everyone else complained about the temperature. The way she finished physical conditioning drills breathing normally, while the rest of us wheezed and staggered. The way she looked at genuinely dangerous simulations with an expression that read less like fear and more like mild professional interest. Standing in that staging bay before the blizzard drill, watching her scan the storm readouts with the same expression she might use to check whether it was going to rain during a weekend off, I found myself recalculating everything I thought I understood about her all over again. Marlowe raised her hand anyway. Voss's eye twitched, just slightly. "Reyes, is there a reason nobody packed anything to eat that's actually good?" Marlowe asked, completely straight-faced. "The ration bars taste like compressed sadness." For a moment, nobody moved. I genuinely thought Instructor Voss might have some kind of aneurysm right there in front of 54 cadets. A few people laughed nervously, myself included, because it felt like the kind of joke you laugh at out of sheer disbelief rather than actual humor. Voss stared at Marlowe for 3 full seconds, which doesn't sound long until you have actually experienced 3 seconds of a Threxian instructor's silent judgment. "This is not a culinary review, Cadet Reyes," Voss finally said. "Get in formation." Marlowe shrugged, completely unbothered, and walked toward the drop pods like she was heading to a picnic instead of a moon that had earned its nickname through actual dead bodies of frozen wildlife found by survey teams decades ago. I remember thinking, even then, before anything had actually gone wrong, that there was something deeply unsettling about how calm she was. Not fake calm, not the kind of forced bravado some cadets put on to hide how scared they really were. Genuine, bone-deep calm, like the storm outside was simply weather, and weather was simply something that happened, and she had never once considered it a threat worth being afraid of. We loaded into the pods in groups of 6. I ended up seated across from Marlowe, with Priya on my left, and a quiet Vesserine cadet named Talus on my right. The pod doors sealed with a hiss, and through the small viewport I watched the launch bay fall away as we were fired down toward the moon's surface. The ride down was rough, the kind of turbulence that makes your stomach try to relocate itself somewhere near your throat, and I gripped the harness with all 4 hands, while Priya made a small strangled noise beside me. Talus, seated across from me, had his eyes squeezed shut so tightly that the ridges along his brow had folded into deep grooves, and he muttered something under his breath, in his native tongue, that I recognized as a prayer, though I did not know the exact words. Even Callum, who prided himself on being unshakable, had both hands wrapped around his harness straps hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale beneath his skin. The pod shuddered violently as it broke through the moon's upper atmosphere, the metal groaning around us in a way that made my hearts, both of them, stutter out of rhythm for a moment. Warning lights flickered along the interior paneling, amber, then red, then amber again, and somewhere above us, a mechanical voice announced final descent sequence in the flat, unbothered tone that automated systems always used regardless of how badly things were actually going. I found some strange comfort in that voice. It did not know enough to be afraid. I envied it. Marlowe just watched the window, humming something quietly to herself. I couldn't make out the tune. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she was humming at all, during a descent that had every other cadet in that pod praying to whatever gods they believed in. "You're not scared," I said, because I couldn't stop myself from asking. She glanced at me, and there was something almost kind in the look, like she understood exactly why I was asking and didn't hold it against me. "Should I be?" she asked. "It's a level 9 storm," I said. "People fail this drill constantly. People get hurt." Marlo considered that for a moment, tilting her head the same way she had in the briefing room. "Where I grew up," she said, "a level 9 storm was called Tuesday." I didn't know how to respond to that, and I still don't think I fully believed her. Not completely. Not yet. But something in the way she said it, so plainly, so without any need to impress anyone, made a small cold feeling settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside the pod. The landing hit hard, the pod slamming into packed snow with enough force to rattle my teeth, and the doors blew open to a wall of white that swallowed the world whole. The wind screamed. That is the only word for it. It screamed like something alive, tearing across the frozen plain with a fury that made the storm readouts in the briefing room look like a polite understatement. My suit's internal display flashed a temperature reading that made my stomach drop even further than the descent had. Negant 62 degrees, wind chill factored in, and climbing worse by the minute. "Move," Voss's voice crackled over the comm, distant and distorted by the storm. "Extraction point Delta, 11 kilometers, 4 hours. Go." I stumbled out into the white with the others, and within 30 seconds, I had already lost sight of half my squad. The storm didn't just reduce visibility, it erased it, turning the world into an endless churning blur, where up and down became suggestions rather than facts. I checked my compass, which flickered uselessly. The storm's electromagnetic interference, already scrambling half our equipment, exactly as the briefing had warned us it would. Around me, other cadets were shouting, trying to find each other, trying to form up into the small groups we had been trained to use for these situations. Because a lone cadet in a level 9 storm on Cassandra Minor was, statistically, a cadet who was not making it to extraction. I grabbed for Priya's arm and found only empty air. I heard Callum's voice somewhere to my left, panicked, calling out names that got swallowed by the wind before they reached anyone who could answer. And that was when the first beacon went off. The sound was distinct, a sharp electronic chirp that cut through even the howling wind, broadcast to every suit in the drill zone as a kind of grim public announcement. "Cadet down!" Cadet pulled. I didn't know who it was yet, but I knew what it meant, and I felt something twist in my stomach that had nothing to do with the cold. 3 minutes into the exercise, I thought. 3 minutes, and someone had already failed. It would not be the last beacon. Not even close. I pushed forward through the snow, my legs already burning with the effort of moving through drifts that came up past my knees, my suit's heating elements struggling against wind that seemed almost personally offended by our presence. Somewhere behind me, I heard Talus's breathing turn ragged over the comm, short and panicked, the kind of breathing that precedes a mistake. I turned, trying to find him in the white, and for a moment, I caught a shape moving toward me through the storm, tall, steady, unbothered by the wind, in a way that seemed almost impossible. It was Marlo. She had somehow found me in a storm that had scattered 54 trained cadets within the first 3 minutes, moving through the snow with a kind of loose, easy stride that looked less like survival and more like a walk she was mildly enjoying. Her suit's exterior was already crusted with ice, same as mine, same as everyone's, but her posture held none of the tension I felt radiating through my own limbs. "Stay close," she said, her voice calm and clear over the short-range comm, cutting through the storm's noise with an authority that had nothing to do with rank. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." Behind her, another beacon chirped. Then another. I did not know it yet, standing there in the freezing dark with a human girl who seemed to think the deadliest drill in the Academy's history was mildly inconvenient weather. But by the time the storm finished with us, 52 cadets would have failed. 52 beacons, 52 careers, marked with a black stain that would follow them for years. I looked at her, really looked, through the driving snow and the failing light, and something about her calm began to feel less like recklessness and more like knowledge. a kind of knowledge none of the rest of us possessed. She was not ignoring the danger. She was measuring it, quietly, the way someone measures a familiar road before deciding how fast they can safely drive it. I did not understand yet what that meant. I only knew that for the first time since the pod doors had opened onto that screaming white wasteland, I felt something other than pure fear. Another beacon chirped somewhere to the south, faint and swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Then another, closer, close enough that I thought I recognized the frequency pattern as belonging to someone from my own squad. Talus, maybe, or Callum. I could not be sure, and there was no time to find out, because Marlowe had already turned and started walking, her pace steady, unhurried, certain, and the only thing my frozen, terrified mind could think to do was follow her. And somewhere in the chaos, while the rest of us fought simply to survive, Marlowe Reyes was already thinking about marshmallows. The snow came up to my knees now, and every step felt like dragging my legs through wet cement that had somehow also learned how to bite. I followed Marlowe's silhouette through the storm, using the faint outline of her suit against the white as my only reliable guide, because my compass had given up entirely, and the navigation overlay in my helmet display kept dissolving into static every few seconds. Behind us, the beacons kept chirping, one after another, a grim rhythm section to the storm's endless howling melody. "Where are we going?" I shouted over the comm, my voice cracking against the cold air filling my lungs even through the suit's heating filters. "There's a ridgeline about 400 meters ahead," Marlowe called back, her tone as level as if she were giving directions to a nearby cafe. "It'll cut the wind. We regroup there, figure out who's still up, then move together." "How do you know there's a ridgeline?" I asked. "The map's useless out here. I looked at the terrain scan before we dropped," she said. "Old habit." I filed that away, along with everything else about her that did not quite add up. Most cadets barely glanced at terrain scans beyond the bare minimum required by the briefing. Marlowe apparently studied them the way some cadets studied battle history texts, absorbing every ridge and gully and drainage channel, as though her life depended on remembering them, which, I was beginning to suspect, she genuinely believed it did, regardless of what the official difficulty rating claimed about this particular storm. We reached the ridgeline 11 minutes later, and the difference the moment we crossed into its lee side was immediate and almost shocking. The wind dropped from a scream to something closer to an angry mutter, and for the first time since the drop, I could actually hear myself think. Marlowe crouched low against the rock face, scanning the storm behind us, and I saw 3 other shapes stumbling toward the same shelter, drawn by instinct or luck, or the simple visual logic of following the terrain toward whatever cover it offered. It was Priya first, then Callum, then a Dravith cadet named Osric who I barely knew, beyond nodding to him in the mess hall. All 3 looked as wrecked as I felt, faces pale behind their helmet visors, breathing hard, movements sluggish in the particular way that meant their suits were losing the battle against the cold faster than any of us wanted to admit. "Talus isn't with you," I said, my chest tightening. Priya shook her head, unable to speak for a moment, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts that suggested she was fighting to keep herself from either crying or hyperventilating, possibly both at once. "He went down about 200 meters back," she finally managed. "Beacon triggered." I saw the light. I couldn't reach him in time. The wind just took him the other direction. I felt something heavy settle in my stomach, the particular kind of guilt that comes from surviving a moment someone else did not, even when there was nothing you could have done differently. Talus had been quiet, careful, meticulous in his studies, the kind of cadet who read every regulation twice before acting. It seemed almost unfair that carefulness had not been enough to save him from a storm that did not care how carefully you studied it beforehand. "He's not hurt," Marlowe said firmly, her voice cutting through the small silence that had fallen over the group. "The beacon pulls him out safely. That's what it's for. He failed the drill. He didn't die. Those are very different things, and right now we need to focus on the difference, because feeling bad about it is not going to help the rest of us reach extraction." It was not a cruel thing to say. If anything, it landed with a strange kind of relief, cutting through the spiraling guilt that had started to eat away at my focus. I looked at her properly then, crouched against the rock with melting frost already forming delicate patterns along the edge of her visor, and I realized that whatever fear the rest of us were carrying, she had simply set hers down somewhere before the drop. The way you might set down a heavy bag before a long walk you already knew how to make. Okay, Priya said, wiping at her visor with a gloved hand, even though the gesture did nothing useful. Okay, what's the plan? Marlowe pulled up her wrist display, the small holographic projection flickering weakly in the residual static that the storm still threw at every electronic device within range. Extraction point Delta is roughly 8.3 kilometers from here, she said. We've used almost 40 minutes already. At the pace we were moving before, that's going to take us closer to 3 hours through open terrain, and that's assuming nobody else gets picked off along the way. I don't like those odds. So what do we do instead? Callum asked, his voice tight with a frustration that I recognized as barely restrained panic, looking for somewhere useful to go. We stop fighting the storm head-on, Marlowe said, and start using it. There's a drainage channel that should run roughly parallel to our bearing for most of the distance. Cut low enough into the terrain that it'll block a lot of the direct wind. It'll add maybe half a kilometer to our route, but if it cuts our exposure time by even a third, that's worth it. Osric, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his translator implant giving his words a faint metallic undertone. How do you know all this? None of us studied the terrain scans this closely. There wasn't time before the drop. Marlowe paused, just for a moment, and something crossed her expression that I could not quite identify, gone before I could examine it properly. There was time, she said simply. I made time. Nobody pushed the point further, though I could tell Osric wanted to. There was something in the set of Marlowe's shoulders that suggested this was not a conversation she particularly wanted to have. Not here, not now, with the storm still howling on the other side of the ridge, and 3 exhausted, frightened cadets depending on her to get them somewhere safe. I understood, in some instinctive way, that whatever experience had taught her to prepare like this, to treat every environment as a potential threat worth studying in exhaustive detail before ever setting foot in it, was not something she talked about casually. We moved out 5 minutes later, following the ridgeline down into the drainage channel Marlowe had described, and she was right about the wind. It was not gone. Not by any measure, but it dropped enough that conversation became possible again without shouting. And more importantly, our suit temperature readings stopped their steady, terrifying decline and began, cautiously, to stabilize. As we walked, single file, boots crunching through the packed snow at the channel's base, I found myself moving up alongside Marlowe, curiosity finally overriding the exhaustion pulling at every part of my body. Can I ask you something? I said. You're going to whether I say yes or not, she replied, though there was no real irritation in it, just a kind of tired amusement. Fair, I admitted. What was it actually like, growing up where you grew up? Because either everyone at the academy is exaggerating everything about your homeworld, or we are all somehow still underestimating it, and I genuinely cannot tell which. Marlowe was quiet for a few steps, her breath visible in short clouds through the gap in her scarf where her visor met her collar seal. Both, she said eventually. People exaggerate the specific stories, because specific stories are the ones that get repeated. Someone's cousin fought off some large predator with a kitchen implement. Someone's grandmother walked 11 kilometers through a snowstorm to get medicine. Someone's neighbor survived a fall that should have killed them twice over. Those stories get told at parties, get passed around, get bigger every time. But the exaggeration isn't really the point. The point is that stories like that were normal enough to become stories in the first place. Nobody tells stories about things that never happen. I tried to imagine that, an entire world where survival stories were common enough to become casual conversation rather than remarkable exceptions, and found that I could not quite hold the shape of it in my mind. My own homeworld, Ithkar Prime, was gentle by comparison, temperate climate, manageable wildlife, weather patterns predictable enough that our meteorological services rarely issued anything more serious than a mild storm advisory. The idea of a level 9 blizzard being casually referred to as Tuesday genuinely unsettled something in me, some deep assumption about what a livable world was supposed to look like. So this, I said, gesturing vaguely at the storm, still audible beyond the drainage channel's walls. This doesn't scare you at all. It scares me a normal amount, she said. I'm not reckless. I know people die in storms like this. I know the temperature out there could kill me if I got careless enough for long enough. But scared and overwhelmed are different things. I know what this kind of cold does. I know how to read it, how to work with it instead of against it. That's the difference between fear and panic, I think. Fear tells you something is dangerous. Panic tells you that you don't know what to do about it. I'm not panicking, because I do know what to do about it. We walked in silence after that for a while, the group's pace steady and controlled now, following Marlowe's lead with a trust that had grown, almost without any of us noticing, from wary uncertainty into something closer to genuine reliance. Every so often another distant beacon would chirp, carried faintly on the wind from somewhere else across the drill zone, and each time I felt that same small twist of guilt and relief tangle together in my chest. Somewhere out there, other cadets were failing, being pulled from the storm one by one, while our small group pressed forward through a channel that Marlowe had somehow known to look for before any of us had even boarded the drop pods. The drainage channel began to narrow as we pushed further along it, the rocky walls rising higher on either side, until the wind above us became a distant howl, rather than the direct assault it had been out on the open plain. Osric took point for a while, giving Marlowe a chance to check on Priya, whose suit readings had started to flicker in a way none of us liked. I watched Marlowe crouch beside her without breaking stride in her own alertness, running a gloved hand along the seam of Priya's collar seal, checking the small diagnostic panel embedded there, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this kind of check 100 times before, in conditions far worse than this. "Seals holding," Marlowe said after a moment, more to herself than to any of us. "Just cold fatigue. Nothing that a few minutes of controlled effort won't work through. Priya, I need you to focus on your breathing pattern. In for 4 counts, hold for 2, out for 4. It'll help regulate your core temperature better than fighting the shivering will." Priya nodded, too exhausted to argue, and began following the count under her breath, her voice steadier with each repetition. I found myself quietly impressed, not for the first time, at how naturally Marlowe seemed to slip into the role of someone managing a crisis, rather than someone caught inside one. It was not arrogance. I want to be clear about that, because if I had met her under different circumstances, I might have assumed her calm confidence was some kind of performance, a mask worn to seem impressive in front of squadmates who did not know any better. But there was nothing performative in the way she checked Priya's seal, or the way she adjusted our pace without announcing it, or the way she kept glancing back to make sure Callum, who had gone quiet and pale somewhere behind us, was still keeping up. "Callum," she called back at one point, not unkindly. "Talk to me. How are your hands feeling?" "Fine," he muttered, though the slight delay before he answered suggested otherwise. "Fine like actually fine, or fine like you're worried admitting the truth makes you look weak in front of everyone," Marlowe asked, and there was just enough warmth in her tone that it did not feel like an accusation. Callum was quiet for a moment. "They're a little numb," he admitted finally. "Fingertips mostly." Marlowe nodded, already moving toward him, pulling a small chemical warmer from a pouch on her belt that I had not even noticed her packing before the drop. Standard kit didn't include those. I would have remembered. "Put these against your palms, inside your gloves if you can manage it without losing too much heat in the process," she instructed, pressing the small warming packets into his hands. "It's not much, but it buys us time." "Where did you even get those?" Osric asked, echoing the question I had been too tired to voice myself. "I packed extra," Marlowe said simply. "Standard kit assumes best-case exposure management. I don't like assuming best case, in situations where the worst case can kill you." I turned that thought over in my mind as we kept walking, the channel gradually widening again, as it curved toward what I hoped, desperately, was the direction of extraction point Delta. She had prepared as though she expected the drill's official parameters to be wrong, as though she had learned somewhere, through some experience none of us shared, that official assessments of danger were often little more than a starting estimate, rather than a reliable guarantee. I did not yet know how right that instinct would turn out to be. None of us did. But looking back now, I think some part of her had already sensed what the rest of the academy would not discover until much later, that this storm was worse than anyone in the briefing room had accounted for, and that the difference between the cadets who survived it and the 52 who did not would come down almost entirely to whether they had someone like Marlowe Reyes walking beside them. By the time we reached the halfway point to extraction, 90 minutes into the drill, I had stopped thinking of Marlowe Reyes as simply an unusual squadmate with strange habits, and started thinking of her as something closer to the only reason any of us were still standing. The ground shook first, a low tremor that rolled up through the soles of my boots before any of us understood what was happening. And then the entire drainage channel ahead of us collapsed in a roar of displaced snow and shattered ice, sealing off the route Marlowe had chosen, not 60 seconds after we had committed fully to it. "Nobody move," Marlowe snapped, her voice suddenly sharp in a way I had not heard from her before. All traces of casual warmth gone, replaced by something focused and immediate. "Stay against the wall." That wasn't natural collapse. The storm's pressure differential is triggering ice shelf failures across the whole basin. There could be more. I pressed myself flat against the channel wall, my heart's hammering, watching through the drifting snow as the collapsed section settled into a jagged new barrier between us and the route forward. Priya had grabbed onto Osric's arm without seeming to notice she had done it, her breathing pattern from earlier completely abandoned in favor of short, panicked gasps. Callum stood frozen, quite literally, staring at the collapse with an expression that suggested his mind had simply stopped processing new information for a moment. "I don't understand," Osric said, his translator crackling slightly with the strain in his voice. "The briefing said standard severity. This isn't standard. This isn't anything close to standard." He was right, and the realization of just how right he was settled over the four of us like another kind of cold entirely, one that had nothing to do with temperature. I had assumed, the way we had all been trained to assume, that the Academy calibrated these drills with careful precision, that the danger was real but bounded, contained within limits that instructors understood, even if we did not. Standing there watching an ice shelf collapse without warning in a channel that should have been stable enough to shelter us safely, I understood for the first time that whatever was happening to the storm on Cassandra Minor had moved past the Academy's careful calculations entirely. Marlowe was already moving, scanning the collapsed section with quick, methodical attention, running her gloved hand along the exposed ice at its edge, testing something I could not identify. "Solar flare!" she said after a moment, mostly to herself, though loud enough for the rest of us to hear over the wind. "Has to be. That's the only thing that explains interference this severe plus thermal instability this fast. The storm's not behaving the way the briefing described, because the briefing was written for a different storm than the one actually happening right now." "That's not possible," Callum said, finally finding his voice again, though it came out thin and unsteady. "The instructors would have pulled us. They wouldn't drop 54 cadets into a storm they didn't understand." "They didn't drop us into a storm they didn't understand," Marlowe said, turning to look at him directly. "They dropped us into a storm that changed after we were already down here. There's a difference. And right now the difference doesn't matter, because we still need to get to extraction regardless of why the storm got worse." I checked my suit's exterior temperature reading and felt my stomach drop even further. The number had climbed past what the briefing had described as the outer edge of survivable exposure, and it was still climbing, the storm's fury intensifying around us with every passing minute, rather than settling into the predictable pattern we had all trained to expect. Somewhere above the channel walls, I could hear the wind shifting into something with a different, more violent pitch, a sound I had never heard a storm make before, and hoped never to hear again. "We need a new route," Marlowe said, already pulling up her wrist display, the holographic projection stuttering badly now, under the worsening interference. The collapse blocked the direct channel, but there was a secondary route on the terrain scan, longer, but it climbs instead of staying low, which means less risk of another shelf failure catching us underneath it. "Longer means more exposure time," Osric pointed out. "Staying here means certain exposure to whatever collapses next," Marlowe replied. "I'll take the route with better odds even if it costs more time. Standing still in a place that's already proven unstable is not a plan, it's a countdown." She led us up out of the channel, back into the full force of the storm, and the difference was immediate and brutal, the wind slamming into us with a violence that made the earlier exposure feel gentle by comparison. I heard Priya cry out as a particularly vicious gust nearly took her off her feet entirely, and Osric's larger frame moved instinctively to shield her, the two of them staggering forward together, while Callum and I fought to keep pace behind Marlowe, who moved through the chaos with a grim, focused determination that had replaced her earlier calm without entirely erasing it. This is where the beacons started going off in earnest. A chorus of chirping alerts scattered across the storm, some near, some distant, each one marking another cadet pulled from an exercise that had stopped being a controlled drill and become, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, something closer to an actual survival situation. I lost count of how many I heard. Later, back at the academy, I would learn the final number. 52 cadets total, more than the drill had ever claimed before, a statistic that would haunt the instructor's post-drill review for weeks afterward. But in that moment, all I understood was that the chirping seemed to be everywhere, and that every chirp meant one more person out there who had not made it, and that the storm around us showed no sign of relenting long enough to let the rest of us catch our breath. My beacon nearly went off twice. I remember the first time clearly, a moment when my legs simply refused to keep moving through a drift that had risen past my waist, my suit's core temperature warning flashing amber against my visor's display, my whole body screaming at me to stop, to rest, to let the automated system make the decision my exhausted mind no longer trusted itself to make. It was Marlowe who reached back and grabbed my arm, hauling me forward with a strength that startled me even after everything I had already witnessed, her grip firm enough to bruise through the suit's padding. "Not yet," she said, her voice cutting through the storm and the fog settling over my thoughts alike. "You've got more in you than this. Move your legs, Owen. One step, then another. Don't think about the distance. Just think about the next step." I do not know, even now, whether it was her words or simply her presence that pulled me back from the edge of giving up, but something in the sheer certainty of her tone reached past the exhaustion and the cold and found whatever reserve of stubbornness I had left. I moved my legs, one step, then another. The drift released me eventually, and I stumbled forward into slightly more manageable snow, gasping, my whole body shaking with effort and cold in equal measure. The second time was worse, further along, when a gust hit with enough force to actually knock me flat, my faceplate driving into packed snow hard enough to rattle my skull, and for a moment, just a moment, lying there in the white with the storm screaming above me, I genuinely considered simply staying down. It would have been so easy. The beacon would trigger automatically if my vitals dropped far enough, and someone would come, and I would fail the drill. And failing the drill was not the end of the world. Marlowe herself had said as much, back at the ridgeline about Talus. Then a hand closed around my wrist, hauling me up out of the snow with a firmness that left no room for negotiation, and I found myself looking up into Marlowe's visor, snow crusted along its edges, her expression unreadable behind the reflective surface, but her voice, when it came, carrying an intensity that cut through everything else. "Get up," she said. "Not because failing is shameful. It isn't. But because you have more left than you think you do. And I refuse to let you find out you were wrong about your own limits by giving up before you actually reached them." I got up. We reached the base of the climbing route Marlowe had identified roughly 2 hours and 10 minutes into the drill, the storm still raging around us with an intensity that showed no sign of the predictable weakening pattern the briefing had promised. Above us, the terrain rose in a series of rocky switchbacks, exposed to the full force of the wind, and I understood, looking up at that climb through the white chaos, that the hardest part of the drill was still ahead of us. Marlowe gathered the four of us close before we started up, crouching low against a boulder that offered a small pocket of relief from the worst of the gusts, and for the first time since the ice shelf had collapsed, I saw something flicker across her expression that looked almost like genuine concern rather than her usual steady calm. "I'm not going to pretend this next part is easy," she said, looking each of us in the visor in turn. "The climb is exposed the whole way up. No cover. Wind's going to try to peel us off the rock if we let it. We go slow. We go together. We test every handhold before we trust our full weight to it. If anyone's vitals drop into the red during the climb, you tell me immediately. You do not push through it and hope it passes. Because on exposed rock, pushing through it is how people fall." Priya's breathing had steadied somewhat since the drainage channel, though her hands trembled visibly even through her thick gloves as she flexed her fingers, trying to work feeling back into them. "I can do this," she said, and I believed her, mostly because I think she needed someone to believe her, including herself. Osric checked the anchor points on his climbing harness, a habit so automatic that I suspected he had done it 1,000 times in training simulations that had never felt anywhere near as real as this moment did. Callum said nothing at all, but he nodded. Once, firm and decisive. And something in that small gesture told me he had found whatever reserve of resolve he needed, somewhere in the last 2 hours of watching Marlowe refuse to let any of us give up. We started the climb together, Marlowe leading, checking each section of exposed rock before waving the rest of us forward, her movements economical and precise, despite the wind trying constantly to tear us from the mountainside. I focused on her instructions exactly as she gave them, one handhold at a time, one foothold at a time, refusing to let my mind wander far enough ahead to calculate how much further we still had to climb, because that kind of calculation, I had learned in the last 2 hours, was the fastest way to convince yourself that continuing was impossible before you had actually tried. Halfway up, disaster nearly found us again, when a section of rock beneath Callum's boot crumbled without warning, and for one heart-stopping second, he swung free on his safety line, boots scrabbling uselessly against the icy stone, while the wind screamed around him like it had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Osric lunged, catching Callum's flailing arm and hauling him back toward the rock face with a strength that surprised even me, and Marlowe was already climbing back down toward them, calling instructions in a voice that stayed steady, even as my own hearts pounded against my ribs hard enough to hurt. "You're fine," she said, guiding Callum's boot to a more stable ledge just below the crumbled section. "You're fine. You're secured. Breathe. Find your grip again. That's it. Good. Now up. Slow and steady." It took nearly 10 minutes to get Callum stable again and moving. 10 minutes that felt like an hour, with the storm screaming around us, and the temperature continuing its relentless climb into ever more dangerous territory. But we did get him moving, and we did continue the climb, and somewhere in the back of my exhausted mind, I filed away the memory of Marlowe descending back into danger, without a moment's hesitation to help a squadmate who was not even injured yet, only frightened, only one crumbling handhold away from a mistake that could have been far worse. We crested the top of the switchbacks a little over 2.5 hours into the drill, collapsing briefly against the leeward side of the ridge to catch our breath in the relative shelter it provided, and looking out from that height, through gaps in the driving snow, I could just make out the distant flicker of the extraction beacon marking Delta Point, still agonizingly far away, but visible now, real now, no longer just a set of coordinates on a failing navigation display. "We're close," Priya breathed, something like hope creeping back into her voice, for the first time since the collapse.
"Close isn't there yet,"
Marlowe said, but there was warmth in it this time, not the sharp focus of crisis, but something gentler, something that sounded almost like pride. "Get up, we finish this." I understood, looking up at the climb through the white chaos, that the hardest part of the drill was still ahead of us, and that we had already lost more than half our original number, to a storm that had stopped playing by anyone's rules a long time ago. The extraction beacon at Delta Point should have meant the end of our ordeal, a warm shuttle waiting to lift us off Cassandra Minor and back into the safety of orbit. But when we finally staggered down the far side of the ridge and across the last stretch of open ground toward it, we found only a support tent, half collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, its emergency lighting flickering weakly in the storm, and no shuttle in sight at all. "Where's the extraction craft?" Osric demanded, his voice tight with a frustration that mirrored exactly what the rest of us were feeling after 3 hours of fighting through the worst conditions any of us had ever experienced. Marlowe was already moving toward the tent's control panel, brushing snow away from its display with quick, efficient motions. "Grounded," she said after a moment, reading whatever diagnostic information the panel offered. "Wind speeds exceeded safe flight parameters almost an hour ago. They can't send anything down until the storm drops below a threshold it's nowhere close to right now. So we made it to extraction, and extraction isn't actually extracting anyone," Callum said, a note of hysteria creeping into his exhausted voice. "That's fantastic. That's exactly what I needed to hear right now." I understood his frustration completely, because I felt it too, a wave of bitter disappointment crashing over the relief we had all felt just minutes earlier at the sight of the beacon's light. We had fought through a collapsing ice shelf, an exposed climb that had nearly claimed Callum entirely, and hours of a storm that seemed determined to prove the briefing's calculations wrong at every turn, and now we stood at the finish line, only to discover that the finish line itself had been swallowed by the same chaos we had barely survived crossing. Marlowe, to her credit, did not waste a single second on disappointment. She pulled up the comm channel built into the tent's control panel, her voice calm and businesslike, as she reported our position and status to whoever was monitoring the drill from the Academy's operations center, back in orbit, safe and warm, and undoubtedly staring at readouts that told them exactly how badly this exercise had gone off script. 4 cadets, extraction point Delta, she reported. Requesting shelter protocol until flight conditions improve. We have 1 cadet with mild frostbite risk on the extremities and general exhaustion across the group. No critical injuries. The response crackled back, distorted by the storm's interference, but I caught enough of it to understand the gist. Shelter protocol confirmed. Estimated flight window in 90 minutes to 3 hours, depending on storm behavior. Emergency supplies cached in tent storage. Hold position. 90 minutes to 3 hours, Priya repeated, sinking down against the tent's damaged frame, her legs finally giving out now that the immediate crisis of movement had ended. In this cold, in a tent that's half fallen down already. That's when Marlowe did something that, looking back, tells you everything you need to know about the difference between someone who had trained to survive extreme conditions in a classroom and someone who had lived through them as an ordinary fact of childhood. She looked around at the collapsed tent, at the scattered emergency supplies half buried in drifted snow, at the 4 exhausted, frightened cadets depending on her, and something in her posture shifted from the tense alertness of crisis management into something calmer, more purposeful, almost, though it seemed impossible given everything we had just survived, cheerful. "All right," she said, clapping her gloved hands together once. "This is actually the easy part." "Easy?" Osric repeated, disbelief thick in his translated voice. "Compared to what we just did." "Yes," Marlowe said, already moving toward the collapsed section of the tent, assessing the damage with quick, practiced eyes. "We have a partial structure, we have supplies, we have 4 people who can work together, instead of fighting a storm blind in the open. This is basically camping, with slightly worse weather than usual. Give me 10 minutes. I want to describe exactly what happened over the next stretch of time, because it changed something fundamental in how I understood Marlowe Reyes, and how I understood the gap between what the rest of us had learned in Academy survival courses, and what she had learned simply by growing up on a planet that expected this level of competence as a baseline requirement for reaching adulthood. She had the collapsed section of the tent restructured within minutes, using a combination of the tent's own damaged support poles and rocks gathered from the exposed ground nearby, wedging and lashing them together with a length of cord pulled from her belt kit until the structure held firm against the wind, in a way it clearly had not before her intervention. She found the emergency supply cache, buried under snow that had drifted against the tent's northern wall, and began sorting through it with the efficient speed of someone who had done inventory like this more times than she could count, setting aside thermal blankets, a portable heating unit, ration packs, and a small stove designed for exactly this kind of emergency shelter situation. Then, while the rest of us sat huddled together trying simply to stop shaking, she got the stove running using a combination of the emergency fuel cell and a technique for shielding the flame from wind that none of us had ever been taught in any survival course, and within 20 minutes, the inside of that half-collapsed tent had gone from a frozen, hostile space to something that, almost unbelievably, felt close to comfortable. I sat there watching her work, feeling the warmth slowly return to my extremities, and found myself thinking about everything she had said during the climb, and the drainage channel, and the long trek across open ground, about a world where survival stories were common enough to become casual party conversation, about a level 9 blizzard being nothing more than an ordinary Tuesday. I had believed her, mostly by that point. But watching her transform a collapsed emergency tent into something resembling an actual shelter within 20 minutes, using nothing but supplies that had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone who actually knew how to use them properly, made the abstract idea of her homeworld suddenly, viscerally real, in a way it had not been before. Priya, still wrapped in a thermal blanket Marlowe had handed her almost as an afterthought, finally spoke, her voice quiet, with something like awe. "How do you know how to do all of this? Not the survival theory, the actual doing of it. Nobody taught us how to reinforce a damaged tent structure using rocks and cordage. Nobody taught us wind shielding techniques for portable stoves." Marlowe paused for a moment, crouched beside the stove, watching the small flame steady itself against the wind now properly deflected by the shelter she had built. "My grandfather taught me most of this," she said finally. "He used to take me and my brother out into the mountains back home for what he called character weekends, though honestly I think he just liked camping and needed an excuse the rest of the family would tolerate. We'd hike out somewhere with barely any gear, build shelter from whatever we found, catch or forage our own food, deal with weather that would probably qualify as extreme by most standards anyone in the coalition would recognize. It wasn't special training. It was just what you did, growing up where I grew up, if you wanted to actually understand the place you lived in, instead of just surviving it by accident." "It sounds terrifying," Callum said, though there was no judgment in it, only genuine wonder. "It sounds normal," Marlowe corrected gently. "That's the thing nobody quite gets about where I'm from. It's not that we're constantly in danger and somehow used to it. It's that the danger is just built into what normal looks like, so you learn to read it early, the way you'd learn to read anything else that was simply part of your daily life. I wasn't scared climbing that ridge today, because I've climbed worse, with less gear, with actual stakes attached if I got it wrong. This drill is dangerous, I'm not pretending otherwise, but it's a kind of danger I already know how to think about." Osric, still working feeling back into his fingers near the stove's warmth, asked the question I suspected all of us had been quietly turning over since the shelter came together. "Doesn't it bother you," he said, "that the rest of us needed you to survive something you consider basically ordinary? That feels like it should be a strange thing to carry around." Marlowe considered the question seriously, not brushing it off the way I half expected her to. "It used to bother me more, back when I first transferred in," she admitted. "I worried people would either resent me for it or expect me to fix every hard situation single-handedly, like my presence made the rest of your training pointless somehow. But that's not really true. You all got yourselves through most of this. I found a better route through the drainage channel, sure, and I built a warmer shelter than most people would have managed with the same supplies. But Priya kept moving on legs that wanted to give out an hour ago." Osric caught Callum out of a fall that could have seriously hurt him. Owen got back up twice when every part of him wanted to stay down. None of that required growing up on a Deathworld. That just required the four of you refusing to quit, and honestly, that's the harder skill to teach. I felt something warm settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the stove, hearing her put it that way, because it reframed the last 3 hours in a light that made the exhaustion feel less like failure narrowly avoided, and more like something we had genuinely earned together. Priya pulled her thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders, some color finally returning to her face now that the shelter's warmth had time to work properly. "Can I ask you something else?" she said. "Something a little less serious." "Always," Marlowe said, a small smile finally breaking through the focused calm she had maintained since the collapse of the ice shelf. "Do you actually miss home?" Priya asked. "Or is it easier being somewhere less dangerous?" Marlowe was quiet for a long moment, adjusting the stove's flame slightly, her expression thoughtful in the flickering light. "Both," she admitted eventually. "I miss it constantly, in small ways I don't always expect. The smell of snow before a storm actually arrives. My grandfather's terrible cooking, which somehow always tasted perfect after a long hike. My brother complaining the entire way up every trail we ever climbed together, and then complaining just as much about wanting to do it again the next weekend. It's easier here, in the sense that fewer things are actively trying to end my day early. But easier isn't always the same as better. I think I needed somewhere less dangerous for a while, honestly. I just didn't expect the Academy's version of less dangerous to include a level 9 blizzard with a solar flare thrown in for good measure." That got a tired, genuine laugh out of all of us, the first real laugh any of us had managed since the drop pod doors had opened onto that screaming white wasteland hours earlier. And something about the sound of it, small and rough and utterly earned, felt like its own kind of small victory against everything the storm had thrown at us. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the shelter's newly reinforced walls, but for the first time since the drop, I felt something close to safety settle over our small group, huddled together around a stove that should not have been working nearly this well in conditions this extreme, warmed by supplies that had been available to every single cadet in that drill and yet had gone unused by everyone except the one person among us who actually understood, in her bones, what it meant to survive somewhere that did not forgive carelessness. The comm panel crackled to life almost an hour into our wait inside the reinforced shelter, and Instructor Voss's voice came through, tight with a barely restrained edge, that told me the operations center was dealing with a situation far worse than anyone had anticipated when this drill began. "Status check. All sheltered groups," Voss said, her tone clipped and businesslike, though I could hear something underneath it that sounded almost like strain. "Report your condition and supply status." Marlowe reached for the comm panel before any of the rest of us could respond, and I watched her expression shift into something almost mischievous, a look I recognized now from the briefing room hours earlier, right before she had asked about the marshmallows the first time. "Delta Shelter Group reporting," she said, her voice perfectly calm and professional. "4 cadets present, all stable, minor frostbite risk resolved with warming measures. Shelter secure and holding against current conditions. Supply status is good across the board. Actually, while I have you, I wanted to file a formal complaint about the ration kit contents." There was a pause on the other end of the comm, long enough that I genuinely wondered if the connection had dropped entirely. "Say again, Cadet Reyes," Voss finally replied, her voice flat in a way that suggested she was certain she had misheard something. "The ration kits," Marlowe continued, completely unbothered, as though she were reporting a genuine operational deficiency, rather than what the rest of us were quickly realizing was, in fact, exactly what she considered a genuine operational deficiency. "We have a working stove, a stable shelter, and 4 cadets who have just survived several hours of significantly worse than advertised conditions. What we do not have is anything resembling proper camping food. The ration bars are fine for basic nutrition, I'm not disputing that. But morale matters during extended shelter protocols, and there is nothing here that even remotely qualifies as an actual treat. No marshmallows, not even the freeze-dried kind, which I would have accepted without complaint. I'm formally requesting this be addressed in future kit loadouts." I stared at her, along with the rest of our small group, in a silence that stretched long enough to become genuinely uncomfortable, broken only by the faint hiss of the stove and the distant howl of the storm still raging outside our shelter's reinforced walls. Priya had both hands pressed over her mouth, shoulders shaking with the effort of not laughing out loud. Osric's translator implant seemed to be struggling to process what it had just heard, emitting a small, confused static burst before settling. Callum simply stared at Marlowe with an expression of pure, undiluted disbelief. "Cadet Reyes," Voss said finally, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that suggested she was choosing her next words with extreme care. "Are you currently experiencing any symptoms of hypothermia, altered mental state, or cognitive impairment that might explain this report?" "No, ma'am," Marlowe replied, entirely serious. "I'm simply taking advantage of a moment of relative calm to provide constructive feedback on the drill's logistical planning. I understand marshmallows might seem like a minor detail given everything else happening out here today. But morale management is a legitimate part of survival protocol, and I feel strongly that future cadets deserve better snack options during extended shelter scenarios. I want to be clear about something. At that exact moment, somewhere beyond our shelter's walls, 48 other cadets had already failed the drill, their beacons triggered by exhaustion, injury, or the simple impossibility of continuing against a storm that had exceeded every parameter the briefing had promised us. 4 more would fail before the exercise finally concluded, bringing the final total to 52, a number that would become, in the weeks that followed, the subject of an emergency review board, several revised safety protocols, and at least one instructor's early retirement. This was not, by any reasonable measure, a moment that called for a discussion about snack logistics. And yet somehow, listening to Marlowe calmly file a complaint about marshmallows while the operations center undoubtedly stared at biometric readouts showing an unprecedented failure rate scrolling past on their monitors, I understood something important about her that I had been circling around, without quite grasping fully, since the moment the drop pod doors had first opened onto that screaming white storm. She was not being flippant. She was not failing to take the situation seriously. She had simply already processed the danger, filed it appropriately in whatever internal system she used to sort threats from inconveniences, and moved on to the next actionable item on her list, which happened to be, in this particular case, snack quality. "This is not the appropriate venue for equipment feedback," Voss said, her voice tight enough now that I suspected several other instructors in the operations center were doing everything in their power not to laugh, or possibly scream, or some combination of both. File a formal report through standard channels after debrief. Understood, ma'am, Marlowe said, entirely unbothered by the rebuke. I'll have it submitted by end of day. Delta Shelter Group, standing by for extraction window update. The comm cut out, and for a moment our shelter fell into a strange, stunned silence, before Priya finally lost the battle against her own laughter, the sound bursting out of her in a way that seemed to release something the entire group had been carrying since the moment we had dropped into that storm hours earlier. I cannot believe you just did that, she managed between gasps. People are failing the hardest drill in Academy history all around us, and you're filing a formal complaint about marshmallows. Marlowe shrugged, though the corner of her mouth had curled into something that was very nearly a genuine grin. We're stable, she said. We're warm. We're going to make it to extraction. Worrying constructively about something small doesn't take anything away from taking the big things seriously. If anything, it means I've got enough attention left over to notice the small things, which is generally a decent sign that the big things are actually under control. Osric shook his head slowly, though there was clear amusement in the gesture. I think, he said, his translated voice carrying a note of something like reluctant admiration, that this story is going to follow you around this academy for the rest of your career. Good, Marlowe said. Someone should remember to bring marshmallows next time. Might as well be everyone. Callum, still recovering from his own disbelief, finally spoke up, his voice carrying the particular exhausted honesty that comes after surviving something genuinely terrifying together. You know, he said, looking around at the four of us huddled in a shelter that should not have held together nearly as well as it had. If someone had told me this morning that I'd survive a level 9 blizzard with a solar flare thrown in, get nearly pulled off a mountainside by a crumbling handhold, and then listen to a formal complaint about camping snacks over the emergency comm channel, all in the same day, I don't think I would have believed a single word of it. Welcome to the Deathworld experience, Marlowe said cheerfully, adjusting the stove's flame with the easy competence that had carried all four of us through the worst hours of our lives so far. It's rarely boring. I found myself laughing along with the others then, a genuine, exhausted, relieved laugh that felt earned in a way few things in my life had ever felt earned before, and looking around at Priya and Osric and Callum, at the shelter Marlowe had built from wreckage and rocks and sheer stubborn competence, I understood that whatever story got told about today, whatever version of events eventually made its way through the Academy's rumor mill, the marshmallow complaint would become the detail everyone remembered first, long after the specific statistics of the drill's record-breaking failure rate had faded into the background of institutional memory. What none of us knew yet, sitting warm and laughing inside that reinforced shelter, was that the marshmallow complaint had not stayed contained to our small comm channel. Standard drill protocol kept every shelter group's communications logged and broadcast on a shared monitoring frequency, accessible to any other group currently sheltering nearby. And it turned out that at least 11 other cadets scattered across 3 separate shelter locations had been listening in on the exchange in real time, desperate for any distraction from their own exhausted, frightened waiting. We found out about this roughly 20 minutes later, when a very different voice crackled over our shared comm, tinny and distant, but unmistakably delighted, belonging to a Vesserine cadet named Kira Fenwick, who had sheltered nearly 2 kilometers away, with a different group entirely. Delta Group, this is Shelter 3, Kira's voice came through, barely containing laughter of her own. We heard the marshmallow thing. We need everyone to know that Shelter 3 fully supports this complaint and would like to be added as a co-signature on the formal report. Marlowe grinned, leaning toward the comm panel. Solidarity appreciated, Shelter 3, she said. I'll add your names to the submission. Another voice cut in, this one belonging to a cadet from a 3rd shelter group even further out. Someone I did not recognize by voice alone. Is it true you filed an actual complaint mid-drill? The voice asked, disbelief evident even through the storm's interference. During an active emergency, about snacks. Morale management is a legitimate operational concern, Marlowe replied, entirely deadpan, and I heard actual laughter erupt from at least 2 different shelter locations across the shared frequency, a strange, warm sound rippling out across a storm that had, until very recently, felt like the loneliest and most hostile place any of us had ever experienced. I sat back against the shelter's reinforced wall, watching Marlowe field questions and good-natured teasing from cadets scattered across the storm, and felt something shift in the atmosphere of the entire drill, subtle but unmistakable. What had begun as a controlled exercise and turned, somewhere around the second hour, into something closer to a genuine crisis, had found, through the strangest possible route, a small thread of shared humanity running through it, connecting exhausted, frightened cadets across kilometers of screaming wind, through nothing more than the sheer absurdity of one very calm human filing a complaint about marshmallows in the middle of the worst storm the Academy had ever recorded. It was, I would come to realize much later, exactly the kind of detail that made Marlowe Reyes so difficult for the rest of us to fully understand. A person capable of navigating collapsing ice shelves and exposed mountain climbs, and hours of exposure that had broken 52 other cadets, who could, in the very same breath, treat a snack shortage as a legitimate grievance worth raising through official channels, because to her, both things were simply part of the same practical, unbothered approach to living somewhere that demanded competence as the baseline price of an ordinary day. The storm broke, finally, a little over 2 hours after we had sealed ourselves inside the reinforced shelter, the wind dropping from its furious scream into something almost gentle, almost apologetic, as though it had simply run out of anger to throw at us. Marlowe noticed the change before any of the rest of us, her head tilting slightly toward the shelter's reinforced wall, listening to something the rest of us had not yet learned to hear. "It's breaking," she said, already moving to check the external readouts on the tent's control panel. "Wind speeds dropping fast. If this holds, extraction window opens sooner than the estimate." She was right. 15 minutes later, the comm crackled back to life, Instructor Voss's voice carrying a note of genuine relief beneath its usual clipped professionalism, informing every remaining shelter group that flight conditions had improved enough to authorize extraction craft, and that pickup would begin within the hour, starting with the groups furthest from the main staging area and working inward. "That's us," Osric said, checking the coordinates against our shelter's position. "We're the furthest out." Marlowe was already moving, gathering the supplies we had used back into their proper storage, restoring the shelter as close to its original configuration as its collapsed frame allowed, a habit of careful order that struck me, even after everything I had already learned about her, as somehow fitting. "Leave it better than you found it," she said, when she caught me watching her work. "Someone else might need this shelter someday. No reason to make their day harder than it has to be." But it was what happened next, as we waited for our extraction craft, that I remember most clearly, more clearly even than the marshmallow complaint, or the collapsing ice shelf, or the moment Callum had nearly fallen from the exposed climb. Marlowe's wrist display chimed with an incoming distress signal, faint and distorted, originating from somewhere roughly a kilometer beyond our shelter's position, well outside the boundary of any group we had been briefed about. "That's not a scheduled extraction point," Osric said, frowning at the signal's coordinates. "It's a beacon," Marlowe said, already pulling her thermal gear back into place, her expression hardening into the same focused determination I had seen during the ice shelf collapse. "Someone triggered an emergency signal, not a standard fail beacon. Different frequency. That means they're not just failing the drill, that means they're actually in trouble. We should radio it in, let the instructors handle it," Callum said, though his voice carried little conviction, and I understood why. The storm had shown all of us, in the cruelest way possible, exactly how quickly circumstances could turn from manageable to dangerous, and exactly how much difference a few minutes of delay could make. Marlowe was already halfway to the shelter's entrance. "I am radioing it in," she said. "I'm also not standing here doing nothing for however long it takes an extraction craft to reach us in weather that's still marginal at best. A kilometer isn't far. I can reach whoever that is, faster than a shuttle can reroute through this wind." I grabbed my own gear without thinking twice, some instinct refusing to let her go back out into that storm alone, after everything we had already survived together. "I'm coming with you," I said. She looked at me for a moment, something unreadable crossing her expression, before she nodded, once, decisively. "Osric, Priya, stay here, coordinate with operations, update them on our position," she said. "Callum, keep the comm open, in case they need a relay point. Owen and I will reach the signal and assess." We moved out together, back into a storm that had gentled considerably but still carried enough bite to remind us exactly how dangerous Cassandra Minor remained even in its calmer moods. Marlowe navigated by the beacon's signal with the same confident precision she had shown throughout the entire ordeal, and within 15 minutes we found the source. A lone cadet, a young Threxian named Denna Voskol, half buried in a snowdrift at the base of a rocky outcrop, her suit's exterior showing the telltale cracked plating of an impact injury, her breathing shallow and labored when Marlowe knelt beside her and checked her vitals. Fell, Denna managed, her voice weak and thin. Slipped on the ridge. Tried to catch myself. Think I broke something. Beacon's been going for 20 minutes. I didn't think anyone would reach me before the shuttle even got authorized to fly. You're not going to have to wait for the shuttle, Marlowe said, her voice calm and steady in a way that I had come to recognize as her particular gift, the ability to make even the worst moments feel, somehow, manageable. We're getting you stable right now, and the shuttle's going to have a much shorter distance to travel once it does launch. What followed was, in its own way, as impressive as everything else I had watched Marlowe do that day, though quieter, more careful, less about brute survival, and more about the precise, practiced competence of someone who understood exactly how to stabilize an injury in field conditions without proper medical equipment. She checked Denna's suit seals first, confirming the crack in the plating had not compromised the thermal integrity enough to cause immediate danger, then splinted what she diagnosed, correctly, as a fractured lower limb, using a section of her own gear and improvised padding, working with a focused efficiency that left no room for hesitation or doubt. How do you know how to do this too? I asked quietly, watching her secure the makeshift splint with practiced hands. Same grandfather, she said, not looking up from her work. Different kind of lesson. Where I grew up, you learned basic field medicine early, because help wasn't always close, and sometimes the difference between a scare and a tragedy was whether the person nearby knew what to do in the first 10 minutes. Denna, pale and shivering but stable now, managed a small, grateful smile. I've heard the rumors about you, she said to Marlowe, her voice still weak but steadier than before. Didn't believe most of them. Might start believing some of them now. Don't believe all of them, Marlowe said, a familiar warmth creeping back into her tone, now that the immediate crisis had passed. Some of them are still exaggerated. Not by much, though. We got Denna back to the main shelter area just as the first extraction craft descended through the thinning storm, its lights cutting through the remaining snow like the most welcome sight any of us had seen all day. The medical team took over immediately, and I watched Marlowe step back, letting them work, her part in Denna's rescue complete, already turning her attention back to the rest of our small group, checking on Priya, on Osric, on Callum, making sure everyone was accounted for and stable, before allowing herself even a moment of relief. It struck me then, watching her move through that chaotic extraction scene with the same steady competence she had shown throughout the entire drill, that something fundamental had shifted in how the rest of us understood her, and not just our small group, but everyone who had heard, secondhand, about the marshmallow complaint, or firsthand, about her unauthorized rescue of a cadet. The official extraction timeline would have reached at least 20 minutes too late for comfort. The wary curiosity that had followed her since her transfer 3 months earlier had transformed, over the course of a single brutal afternoon, into something closer to genuine trust. The kind of trust that gets built not through reputation or rumor, but through watching someone perform, again and again, exactly when it mattered most. As the extraction craft lifted us off Cassandra Minor's surface, leaving the storm and its wreckage behind, I looked around at the exhausted, relieved faces of my squad, and then at Marlowe, sitting quietly near the viewport, watching the frozen moon shrink away beneath us, with an expression that held none of the triumph I might have expected, only a kind of tired, satisfied calm. You saved more than just Denna today, I said quietly, sitting down beside her. She glanced at me, a small, tired smile touching the corner of her mouth. We all saved each other today, she said. I just happen to already know a few tricks the rest of you hadn't learned yet. That's not the same as doing it alone. The shuttle ride back to the Academy's orbital station took nearly 40 minutes, and for most of it, our small group sat in a comfortable, exhausted silence, the kind that only comes after surviving something together that none of you will ever fully explain to anyone who was not there. Priya had fallen asleep almost immediately, her head resting against Osric's shoulder, and he did not seem to mind at all, sitting perfectly still to avoid waking her. Callum stared out the viewport at the stars, slowly replacing the frozen moon below, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he was turning the entire day over in his mind, trying to find some way to file it into a category that made sense. I found myself thinking about the 52 cadets who had failed the drill, wondering how many of them were sitting on other shuttles right now, nursing bruised confidence alongside whatever physical injuries the storm had left them with. I thought about Talus, quiet and careful, pulled from the exercise early, through no real fault of his own, beyond bad luck, and a storm that had refused to behave the way anyone expected. I thought about the instructors back at operations, who had spent the last several hours watching their carefully calibrated drill spiral into something far more dangerous than they had ever intended, and who would spend the coming weeks trying to understand exactly how a routine exercise had become the worst failure rate in the Academy's recorded history. And I thought about Marlowe, sitting quietly beside me, who had walked into that storm with a level of calm the rest of us had mistaken, at first, for recklessness or arrogance, and who had spent every single hour of the crisis that followed, proving, over and over, that her calm had never been either of those things. It had simply been competence, earned somewhere far harder than any of us could easily imagine, wearing the disguise of casual unconcern because that was, for her, exactly what competence looked like when it had become second nature. "Penny for your thoughts," Marlowe said quietly, noticing my silence. "Just trying to figure out how to explain today to anyone who wasn't there," I admitted. "I don't think I have the words yet." "You will," she said. "Give it a few days. Right now everything's still too close. That's normal." "Is it always like this?" I asked. "Back home, does it get easier to talk about, eventually?" She considered the question for a long moment, watching the stars shift slowly outside the viewport. "Some of it," she said. "The parts that are just danger, just survival, those get easier to talk about, because you learn the shape of the story pretty quickly, and it settles into something you can tell, without it costing you anything. But the parts about the people, the ones you couldn't reach in time, or the ones who reached you when you couldn't have made it alone, those stay complicated for a long time, maybe forever. I don't think that's a bad thing, honestly. I think it just means it mattered." I did not fully believe her modesty then, and I am not sure I believe it now, but I understood, watching her settle back against the shuttle's seat with the same unbothered ease she had carried through every hour of that impossible storm, that whatever legend was already forming around her name back at the Academy, the truth underneath it was somehow even more remarkable than the rumors had ever managed to capture. The official numbers came out 3 days after the drill, posted on the Academy's public review board for every cadet to see, and the figures silenced the entire mess hall the morning they went up. 52 cadets failed, out of 54 total participants, the highest failure rate in the recorded history of the Class 9 Blizzard survival drill, by a margin so wide that the Academy's statistics office had apparently needed to double-check their own numbers before publishing them. Only 2 cadets completed the drill without triggering any form of emergency beacon. I was one of them, though I want to be honest and say that credit belongs far more to Marlowe than to anything I managed on my own. She was the other, and by the time the review board finished cross-referencing beacon logs, comm transcripts, and the emergency rescue of Dena Voskol, her name had become the single most discussed topic across every year group in the Academy. The instructors, to their credit, did not try to hide how badly the drill's parameters had failed. Instructor Voss stood before the assembled cadet body during the mandatory debrief and explained, in careful, measured language, that an unpredicted solar flare had intensified the storm's severity, well beyond the exercise's intended threshold, that the Academy's monitoring systems had failed to flag the change quickly enough to abort the drill safely, and that a full review of emergency protocols was already underway to prevent a repeat of what she called, with visible discomfort, an unacceptable margin of danger for a training exercise. What she did not mention, though everyone in that room already knew it from the rumor mill that had been working overtime for 3 straight days, was the marshmallow complaint. I do not know exactly how the story spread as fast and as far as it did. Kira Fenwick and her shelter group certainly played a part, having overheard the entire exchange live and repeated it to anyone who would listen the moment they were back on solid ground. The formal complaint itself, which Marlowe had genuinely submitted through proper channels exactly as promised, apparently made its way into the hands of a supply logistics officer with an excellent sense of humor, who forwarded it to several colleagues with nothing more than a note reading, quote, "You need to see this," unquote. And from there, it seemed to spread through every department in the academy within a single afternoon. By the end of that first week, cadets I had never spoken to before were stopping me in corridors to ask whether the marshmallow story was actually true, whether Marlo Reyes had really filed a formal equipment complaint in the middle of the worst blizzard drill disaster in academy history. I confirmed it every time, because it was true, and because I had watched it happen with my own eyes, and because some part of me had grown genuinely fond of how completely it captured everything strange and wonderful and slightly baffling about the person who had gotten 4 of us through that storm alive. Marlo herself seemed mostly amused by her sudden notoriety, though I noticed she handled the attention with the same understated competence she brought to everything else. When cadets approached her in the mess hall, wanting to hear the story firsthand, she told it plainly, without exaggeration, giving full credit to Priya and Osric and Callum for their own contributions, downplaying her own role in ways that I, having actually been there, knew were not entirely accurate, but understood she genuinely believed regardless. 2 weeks after the drill, the Academy's Supply Logistics Division issued a quiet but very real update to the standard emergency ration kit specifications, adding a small selection of morale supplies to the standard loadout for all future extended shelter scenarios. The update included, among other minor additions, a single line item that several cadets photographed and shared across every social network the Academy's students used, a small addition to the approved supply list that simply read, "Marshmallows, freeze-dried, 1 packet per kit." Nobody officially credited Marlo's complaint for the change. The Logistics Division's public notice cited general morale research and feedback gathered across multiple training exercises, but everyone at the Academy knew exactly where the change had actually come from. And for months afterward, cadets preparing for their own blizzard drills would joke nervously in the staging bay about whether they, too, should remember to file a complaint if things went badly enough. A strange little tradition, born entirely from one calm, unbothered human, deciding that even the worst possible day did not excuse forgetting the small things that made survival feel less like mere endurance and more like something you could actually get through together. I think about that day often, even now, well past graduation, well into my own service aboard a coalition vessel, where the lessons from that storm have proven more useful than almost anything else the Academy taught me. I think about the 52 cadets who failed, and how the Academy's revised protocols, built directly from the mistakes exposed that day, have likely saved more people than any of us will ever know about. I think about Dena Voskol, who went on to complete her own training successfully, and who, the last I heard, still keeps an occasional contact with Marlo, a small friendship forged entirely out of a desperate hour on a frozen ridge. Mostly, though, I think about what Marlo told me on the shuttle ride back, about the difference between danger you understand and panic that comes from not knowing what to do about it, and about a homeworld where survival stories were common enough to become ordinary conversation, and about a level 9 blizzard that some corner of the galaxy would simply call an ordinary Tuesday. I did not fully understand, before that drill, what it meant for the Coalition to classify an entire planet as a death world. I understood the term academically, the way you understand any classification you have read about but never actually witnessed. After that day, I understood it differently, watching one girl walk through conditions that broke 52 trained cadets with nothing more than calm competence and a genuine, sincere concern about snack quality. The galaxy, I have come to believe, still does not fully understand what it invited into the Coalition when humanity joined a decade ago. We see the rumors, the exaggerated stories, the half-believed claims about strength and endurance, and casual disregard for dangers that would terrify the rest of us. And we assume, because it is easier to assume, that the exaggeration accounts for most of the truth. It does not. If anything, I have come to suspect the exaggeration understates it, smoothing over just how ordinary genuine competence can look from the outside when it has been earned through a lifetime of treating survival itself as an unremarkable daily requirement, rather than a rare and desperate struggle. Somewhere out there, across the vast distances the Coalition still has not fully mapped, there are other worlds, other threats, other storms, Far worse than anything Cassandra Minor ever produced. I do not know what the galaxy will do the day it finally meets one of those threats seriously enough to need everything humanity actually has to offer, rather than the small, curious fraction we have been permitted to see so far in training exercises and diplomatic postings. But I know this much for certain, having watched Marlo Reyes walk calmly through the worst storm any of us had ever experienced, while calculating, with genuine sincerity, exactly how much better everyone's day would be with proper snacks included. Whatever nightmare the galaxy eventually faces, I sincerely hope someone remembers to pack the marshmallows. I graduated from the academy alongside Priya, Osric, and Callum 18 months later, all four of us assigned to different ships, scattered across different corners of Coalition space, though we still find ways to stay in contact when duty schedules allow it. Every one of us carries a small piece of that storm with us, I think, in different ways. Priya went on to specialize in emergency medicine, telling me once, quietly, that watching Marlo stabilize Denna's injury on that frozen ridge had shown her exactly what kind of officer she wanted to become. Osric transferred into search and rescue operations, a decision he has never fully explained, but that none of us needed explained, having watched him catch Callum out of a fall that could have ended very differently. Callum, perhaps the most surprising of all of us, requested assignment to cold weather operations training, determined, he told me once with a rueful laugh, to make sure no other cadet ever felt as helpless as he had felt on that exposed mountainside. As for Marlo, she graduated near the top of our class, her academic record solid but unremarkable in the way she seemed to prefer, never drawing more attention to herself than the situation strictly required. She was assigned to a forward operations vessel shortly after graduation, the kind of posting reserved for officers the Coalition trusted to handle genuine unpredictability, and I understand from mutual friends that her service record already includes at least 2 incidents that sound, from the fragments I have heard, remarkably similar to that first storm on Cassandra Minor. Different circumstances, different dangers, the same calm, steady competence carrying people through situations that should have overwhelmed them entirely. I received a message from her not long ago, brief and characteristically understated, mentioning that her current posting had recently completed a supply requisition that included, for the first time in that ship's operational history, a proper stock of actual marshmallows rather than the freeze-dried substitute the Academy had eventually settled on. She seemed genuinely pleased about it, in the small, practical way she seemed pleased about most things, treating the minor victory with exactly the same measured satisfaction she had once brought to filing a formal equipment complaint in the middle of the worst blizzard drill disaster in Academy history. I still think, sometimes, about that first hour on Cassandra Minor, about the sheer terror of watching cadet after cadet trigger their emergency beacons, while the storm raged on with no apparent intention of relenting, about the strange, steady calm of a girl who treated a level 9 blizzard the way the rest of us might treat an unexpected drizzle on an otherwise pleasant afternoon. I think about how close I came, more than once, to giving up entirely, and about the firm, insistent hand that kept pulling me back toward my feet every single time. I think about 52 flunked cadets, a record that still stands, and about the 2 of us who somehow made it through, one of us carried largely by instinct and stubbornness, the other guided by a lifetime of hard-won competence that the rest of the galaxy is only just beginning to understand. The Coalition still does not fully grasp what it welcomed into its ranks when humanity joined a decade ago. I am not certain it ever fully will, not completely. Not until the day arrives when the galaxy faces a threat serious enough to need everything that world has, quietly, unassumingly learned to offer. But I know this much. Having lived through that storm and everything that followed it, whatever nightmare eventually finds us, out there in the vast dark between the stars, I would rather have Marlo Reyes standing calmly beside me than an entire fleet of officers who have never once had to learn what an ordinary Tuesday on a Deathworld actually feels like.